Hello, my dear viewers. This is Menopause Taylor bringing you the state of menopause in the world today. Welcome to today's podcast tutorial. I imagine that you're never surprised about any of my topics, and you've probably come to expect me to talk about just about anything under the sun. Well, today is no different, and in the last podcast, I discussed the differences between the terms cause, risk, association, and length. And I told you that one of the reasons I was presenting a video on those differences is that for every disease related to menopause, I will be giving you a list of risk factors that help you determine whether or not you are at risk for that disease. And for some diseases, you need to know the difference in these terms. And today's topic, you're going to notice that there are some risk factors that have to do with four other terms, which are race, ethnicity, nationality, and religious affiliation. So that is what I'm going to talk about today. Now, you may be thinking, so what? That's easy. But actually, it's not that easy. And that's because the very meanings, distinctions, limitations of race, ethnicity, nationality, and religious affiliation are not as clear-cut as you might have imagined. So this podcast will explain the distinctions and even a little bit of the history of some of them. And you're going to be shocked at how much of this you did not know. If you are of any race, ethnicity, nationality, or religious affiliation, you need to listen to this podcast. So I guess that means everyone should listen. We will start with race. And we'll begin with a discussion of a little bit of history. Race refers to a category of people who share certain inherited physical characteristics, such as skin color, facial features, and stature. Now, originally, people believed that all humans originated from one common ancestor. And factually speaking, all humans do belong to the species Homo sapiens. But as people started migrating around the world over the millennia, natural selection took over. Natural selection favored dark skin for people who lived in hot, sunny climates, which is primarily near the equator. And that's because dark skin has lots of melanin to protect it against severe sunburn and skin cancer. Alternatively, natural selection favored light skin for people who migrated farther away from the equator to cooler, less sunny climates. And that's because dark skin in those parts of the world would have interfered with the production of vitamin D. Originally, there were only three races: white or Caucasian, black or Negroid, and yellow or Mongoloid. These racial classification schemes considered physical traits such as skin color, eye color, hair texture, nose shape, mouth size, and lip thickness. But it also linked those things to intellectual capacities, cultural traits, and moral temperaments. Over time, racial classification shifted from purely biological differences in physical appearance to an indicator of power relations between different groups of people. And eventually, the races were ranked. People of different races were not considered equal in aesthetic beauty, intelligence, temperament, or morality. So ultimately, it subordinated groups of people based upon their racial differences. Not only that, race came to have legal and political identities. And it even affected so-called scientific thinking. See, that's where you'll see it come into play with regard to risk factors for diseases. In some cases, all aspects of one's economic, intimate, social, and political life are structured along racial lines. And the net result is that race alone, without all these other influences, may not be as significant as all of them together when it comes to your risk for a disease. And because race came to signify so much more than just race, the very names of the races began to change in order to make them more politically correct. Instead of calling people black, people started calling them African American. Now, obviously, not everyone who is black is African or American. And the word Mongoloid became politically incorrect, so people started calling Mongoloid people Asian. But Asian is a geographic term, it's not a racial term. But the factual aspects of race became lost in the need to be politically correct. And then people started confusing race with ethnicity. We'll address ethnicity itself in just a bit, but for now I want to just touch on this point. So Hispanic started getting included in the list of race options. Hispanics are not a racial group. Hispanics are white. They just happen to have darker skin than some whites. But the word Hispanic itself means that you speak Spanish. And that means it includes people living in all of the following regions. Spain, which is Europe, Central America, South America, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. They're scattered all over the place. And then there's American Indians. They constitute a culture, not a race. They're white too. So you can see how ethnicity has started to become intermingled with race. Now, back in the days when travel was difficult or impossible, racial groups were fairly pure. But as people started migrating from place to place, they started interbreeding. And of course, that creates a mixing of the races. In other words, there's been a whole lot of hanky-panky going on between the races for as far back as humanity has existed. So if you thought you were a pure blood of any type, you're probably mistaken. The fact is that there isn't much in the way of purity of race these days. Instead, there's a lot of mishmash of the races. In many places, racial categories have been added, removed, revised, and altered, primarily during the past 300 years. This has occurred in response to demographic changes, immigration, political mobilization, technologies, cultural shifts, and economic interests, as well as hanky-panky. And the racial classifications have not been considered equally. For instance, in the United States, there is something called the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule states that if a person of multiracial ancestry has even one drop of black blood, they are considered black, regardless of their appearance, cultural training, or self-identification. And you know, there are many examples of this. President Obama is half white and half black, but he considers himself black. The golfer Tiger Woods is typically called African American, but in fact, his ancestry is 1/2 Asian, divided evenly between Chinese and Thai, 1/4 white, 1/8 Native American, and only 1/8 African American. Census rules have even changed to reflect the fact that the races are impure. So now some census forms include categories like mixed race, multiracial, and other. You know, they actually ought to have a classification for ancestral hanky-panky. We'd all have to check it. In essence, race has become more of a social construct than a biological one. And now, we often see more physical differences within a race than we do between races. For example, some people who identify themselves as white have very light skin, while others have much darker skin. In fact, some whites have darker skin than some blacks. Some whites have very straight hair, while others have very curly hair. Some have blonde hair and blue eyes, while others have dark hair and brown eyes. And of course, there is every combination imaginable. It is estimated that at least 30% of blacks have some white ancestry and that at least 20% of whites have some black ancestry. If clear racial differences ever existed hundreds or thousands of years ago, and many scientists doubt, that such differences ever existed. These differences have become increasingly blurred. Tisk, 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 hanky-panky. You know, I have lived on every continent except Antarctica, and when I lived in South Africa, I learned that black is not black. On multiple occasions when riding in an Uber car with a black driver, I was taken aback when my black driver said something derogatory about black people. And it turns out that there are really many shades of black in South Africa. The designation colored, spelled C-O-L-O-U-R-E-D there, refers to people of mixed black and white descent. But to be colored, both parents have to be colored. Sometimes black people said something derogatory about colored people. You know, whenever something like this happened, I just changed the subject because I had no idea what to say. I mean, saying you look dark enough to be black yourself would have been inappropriate. Yet that's what I was thinking. You see, in South Africa, there are many shades of black, and the word black and the word colored are not the same thing at all. You know, I write all these articles about menopause, and I also wrote articles when I lived in all these different countries. And I wrote articles about all the places I lived while living there and about the way life works there and the confusion that you have if you're a foreigner living there and all the things that are odd and different. And when I was living in South Africa, I wrote an article called 50 Shades of Black. And you can find it on my website if you want to read it. It's a fun read. My website is menopausetailor.me, and it's informative as well as kind of fun. Now, there's another interesting twist to the difference between blacks, whites, and coloreds in South Africa. During apartheid in the 1950s, the government had difficulty classifying people into black, white, and colored categories. This is the government we're talking about. So they came up with a nifty test called the pencil test. It involved poking a pencil into the hair of the person of questionable race. And if it got stuck, the person failed and they were labeled colored. And if it fell out, the person passed and they were labeled white. They even developed a version of the pencil test for blacks who wished to be reclassified, and it was called the pencil shake test. The black person who wanted to be reclassified as a colored person would stick a pencil in their hair and then shake their head. If it fell out, they passed and they were reclassified as colored. If it stayed in place, they stayed black. You know, this pencil test was obviously very inaccurate. And it actually resulted in tearing families apart. Plus, I mean, what do you do with people who are bald? Well, what if their hair is just too short to insert a pencil in the first place? I wrote an article about this too. It's called South African Hair Affairs. And you can find it on my website, which is menopausetailor.me also. And here's the thing that overrides everything else. Genetically, people from different races have DNA that is more than 99.9% the same. In other words, less than 0.1% of all your DNA accounts for the physical differences among people that constitute race. So actually, people with different racial backgrounds are much, much, much more similar than dissimilar. Are you shocked? The bottom line is that we're all a bunch of mutts. And now you can understand why. It's due to hanky-panky mixed with a whole lot of other things.